John Schneider has one of the toughest jobs in football when it comes to being the general manager of the Seahawks. And a lot of times fans think they can handle those duties. What would fans do if they had the opportunity to pick the Seahawks 2023 NFL draft class? We're going to find out in a fan-driven mock draft here on Locked On Seahawks.
You are Locked On Seahawks, your daily Seattle Seahawks podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Greetings, 12. This is Corbin Smith, host of the Locked On Seahawks podcast, your daily Seahawks podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Glad to be joined, as always, by my co-host in crime, Rob Rang. We're now less than 3 weeks away from the draft. It's going to be here before we know it. We're not quite to the point where Rob and I are ready to dish out our final mock drafts. That will be coming in a future mock draft Monday. But as we do each and every year, it's time for the fans to take over for John Schneider and Pete Carroll. Today is our annual fan-driven mock draft. We conducted it today on social media, on Twitter, and always a lot of fun getting all the fans involved to make all 10, or in this case, all 11 of the Seahawks selections for their 2023 draft class. Rob and I are going to be critiquing and grading each of those selections here on today's episode. Now for your lead story here on our Monday edition of Locked On Seahawks. It's fitting with the Seahawks having the number 5 overall selection, their highest pick since 2009, that there's been controversy linked to that selection with one particular prospect. And now he's going to be coming to Seattle tomorrow for a top 30 visit, a critical visit at that. And Rob, I think it's perfect that we're going to be talking about this kid because even though Jalen Carter's got the off-field issues, couldn't finish his pro day workout, Seahawk fans voted nearly unanimously to pick him with the number 5 overall pick, with Anthony Richardson no longer on the board. Over 75% of our fans in this mock draft selected him with that first pick. So Jalen Carter becoming a Seahawk, and it's fitting with the news out there that the team still clearly is doing due diligence on one of the most talented prospects, a player that's certainly got some white flags as well.
No, he absolutely does. And that's one of the things I definitely want to mention here is that, as we did this mock draft exercise and asked our listeners, and the very intelligent, very, they know their club. And I think that's one of the reasons why we've had so much success in doing this and asking the listeners, the viewers, thank you so much for all of you for contributing these things, because sometimes you're going to mention players that, frankly, Corbin maybe had considered some of these prospects, but I had not. So thank you again to all of you for contributing that information. Going back to Jalen Carter here and the possibility with this, with the selection for the Seahawks at number 5 overall. In that mock draft that you spoke of, Will Anderson went earlier. And as you mentioned, Anthony Richardson, the quarterback from Florida. To me, those are the 3 players that we've got to be talking about. Will Anderson, the edge rusher from Alabama, Anthony Richardson, the quarterback from Florida, and Jalen Carter, the defensive tackle from Georgia. Those are the 3 guys I think make the most sense for Seattle, assuming the 2 quarterbacks, Bryce Young, CJ Stroud, go off the board earlier. Then those are the guys that make sense, and obviously Seahawks fans agree with Jalen Carter being, as you mentioned, just the head over heels kind of selection for Seattle at number 5 overall, with our fans contributing this. And that to me is fascinating, because there's going to be a lot of Seahawks fans out there that if the Seahawks do make the selection of Jalen Carter, there's going to be a lot of fans out there who are like, oh my goodness, well, Malik McDowell, all these different reasons why this player does not fit. Seattle can't take this guy. But you watch the tape, Corbin, my goodness, this is the best player in the draft. This is a player who plays a position that Seattle has sorely lacked for a long, long time. This is a Seattle Seahawks defense that finished 30th in the NFL in run defense a year ago. The only 2 teams that finished worse, the Chicago Bears, Houston Texans, and they were the 2 worst teams in football. So it makes every bit of sense in the world that Seattle would do their due diligence. So they would bring Jalen Carter all the way from Atlanta, Georgia to Seattle to make sure that if this is the kind of guy that you want to put into your team, or maybe this is somebody that kind of look away. But I do think that it's fascinating that, as you said, Seattle's listeners and viewers of our program, and again, thank you, selected Jalen Carter here on the very day that the Seahawks are bringing Jalen Carter in for that top 30 visit. I can't wait because Tuesday, April 11th is going to be a big day. That is the day that Jalen Carter is going to be in Seattle. He's going to have that personal visit with the Seahawks, their coaching staff. He is going to be literally in the VMAC, and I would not be surprised. And certainly our listeners and viewers think that this is going to be the case. Would not be surprised at all if a month from now, if Jalen Carter is in the VMAC a little bit more often than just the one day.
Yeah, I think that this certainly, it opens the door for the Seahawks to make this selection again. It really boils down to how this visit tomorrow goes in Renton. And I think it's going to be centered around how he handles questions about the things that have transpired this offseason. What does he show from a character perspective? How does he respond to not being able to finish his pro day workout? What's he done the last 2 weeks? That'd be one of the first questions I would be asking him is, what have you done since that pro day to ensure that you don't have things like that happen again? And you try to figure out how this kid's mind works, because we know Pete Carroll's really good at that with a lot of different types of people. And we know the talent. We talked tons on this podcast about the talent with Jalen Carter. The kid has elite pass rushing ability. I know the sack numbers are not there, but Georgia didn't do him any help by all the twists and stunts that they ran that didn't necessarily put him in position to get right after the quarterback. I think in an NFL scheme like Seattle's, he's going to have more opportunities to take advantage of his pass rushing ability. The conditioning concerns, though, are legitimate. The maturity questions are obviously legitimate. And so that is what is going to be so important tomorrow. If they get the answers they want, if they get the response they want, then maybe Jalen Carter is still very much on their draft board. And right now, Seahawks fans look like they're certainly interested because we know the talent. And oh, by the way, defensive tackles since 2010, when John Schneider arrived, top 5 picks, 4 defensive tackles have been picked. The worst one was Marcel Darius. And by the way, he was an all-pro at one point. So it is a position with a very high hit rate in the top 5, dating back to 2010. So you get a chance to get a guy like Jalen Carter, you got to take advantage of it. Now, there was a second first-round pick in this mock draft, and we actually had some offers on the simulator from Draft Network to move down. Our listeners, though, emphatically shot down those trade offers, said, we want to pick at number 20. And of the 4 players that were on that poll, maybe a little bit of a surprise, but not really if you've been listening to this show, because I know we've talked about him as a possibility, this pick, but our fans went with JAXON SMITH-NJIGBA, the receiver out of Ohio State, for that 20th selection. And Rob, we've talked a lot about this kid, and I know he's not a burner, but he ran a little faster than I expected. Low 4.5s, high 4.4s, which is plenty fast enough when you consider that this guy has elite change of direction skills. We're talking in the 6.6 range on 3-cone. That is phenomenal change of direction skills. He's a great route runner, can create after the catch. This is the kind of receiver that the Seahawks hoped D. Eskridge was going to be. And now 2 years in, we've barely gotten to see any of him on the field because of injuries. When he has played, hasn't provided much production. JAXON SMITH-NJIGBA, though, is that security blanket that would open things up for the rest of the offense, including DK Metcalf and Tyler Lockett. I don't know if he even makes it to 20, but if he does, I anticipate he's going to be one of those players that is squarely on Seattle's draft board. So this seems like a very smart pick.
It absolutely could be. I mean, if Seattle walked out the first round, a couple of weeks from now, Corbin, with Jalen Carter and JAXON SMITH-NJIGBA, then I don't give a damn what any other team did. No team improved their roster more than Seattle did if those are the 2 players that they selected. Now, that's on paper. And we'll see what happens, because just as like there are plenty of reasons why you could question whether Jalen Carter would be a good fit for all those off-field issues, considering that JAXON SMITH-NJIGBA, 30% of his career statistics occurred in 2 games. And there's some miss factor there as well. But as I said before with Jalen Carter, and you just watch the tape, you see an absolutely dominant player, absolutely a top 5 caliber prospect. Same thing with JAXON SMITH-NJIGBA. You see a top 20 caliber prospect. I mean, his size, his hands, you mentioned the short area quickness. That is exceptional. It was the best short shuttle and 3-cone drill that we've seen from the wide receiver this entire draft class, and going back a couple of years of guys who are similarly built. We're talking about exceptional numbers here for a player who was dominant in the Rose Bowl while being, flanked by a guy in Garrett Wilson who wound up winning the Offensive Rookie of the Year. And I have a little bit of disdain for the way the NFL media voted for that. But at the same time, still acknowledgement for what the Garrett Wilson did in New York Jets. The same thing with Chris Olave for the New Orleans Saints. I mean, two spectacular players, and JAXON Smith-NJIGBA was better than both of them. Our buddy Jim Nagy of the Senior Bowl, former Seattle scout, said that JAXON Smith-NJIGBA is the only receiver that he is hearing consistently is getting first-round grades from NFL teams. So if Seattle is able to get Jalen Carter at 5, they're able to get JAXON Smith-NJIGBA at 20, then yeah, I think that you're talking about 2 A grades. And the reason why I didn't give them A grades, because I'm not so sure that, again, that the character concerns with Jalen Carter, maybe he's not even available at that point. Same thing with JAXON Smith-NJIGBA, excuse me. I'm not sure that he's available at Seattle spot at that point. I don't want to say A grades for both these players when I don't know that they're necessarily realistic for Seattle at those spots. And I do have to acknowledge the bust factor that both of these two players offer as well. And so that's why, again, my grades aren't quite as, lofty, I guess, as maybe I think that these two players could provide the Seahawks. But again, I am trying to reflect the fact that I do think that there is some bust factor with these two players as well.
Yeah, these players are high ceiling with the potential to be low floor because of some off-field related stuff, but almost all being injured. There are some question marks here with these two guys. They are not perfect prospects. They're not perfect humans. So, but that being said, they both are first-round caliber talents. And if you can get them in this draft at 5 and 20, and you make sure that they check off all your other boxes off the field, then these have a chance to be home runs for the Seahawks as well. We're going to get to Seattle's 2 second-round picks, a third-round pick, and a fourth-round pick in our fan-driven mock draft coming up next here on our mock draft Monday. Now for a word from our sponsor, BetterHelp. Life can be full of challenges. Recently, my family has undergone significant strife with members dealing with debilitating health issues, and it's been a struggle for me coping with it mentally. Life can be full of twists and turns, so it's important to show yourself through it all, and BetterHelp Online Therapy will assess your needs and can match you with your own licensed professional therapist in less than 48 hours. Therapy worked wonders for me, and I'm still doing it. But don't just take my word for it. Having someone in your corner to guide you when you're struggling to navigate obstacles can be invaluable. This is not a crisis line. It's not self-help. It's professional therapy done securely online and available to people worldwide. With therapy, it can take a few tries to find the right fit for you, but BetterHelp is a great way to invest in yourself. BetterHelp has a special offer for their listeners. Get 10% off your first month at BetterHelp.com/LockedOn. That's 10% off your first month of online therapy at BetterHelp.com/LockedOn. You're listening to Mock Draft Monday here on Locked On Seahawks. I'm your host, Corbin Smith. Glad as always to be joined by my co-host in crime, Rob Rang. And a special thanks to all the 12s out there, as always, for making Locked On Seahawks your first listen 5 days a week. We greatly appreciate it. We're going to continue our fan-driven mock draft here in a moment, but just a friendly reminder to all the 12s out there, we just launched a brand new NFL draft newsletter here at Locked On, and Luke Inman is doing a fantastic job putting that together. So make sure to check out this free resource at lockedonpodcast.com/newsletters to sign up for your free NFL draft newsletter. So we just had our 2 first-round picks selected by you, our listeners. Jalen Carter at number 5, JAXON Smith-NJIGBA, the receiver from Ohio State, at number 20. Now we're going to the second round. Seattle has 2 second-round picks as well, thanks to the Russell Wilson trade. And technically, it'll be the 37th pick in the draft, but with the Dolphins selection being forfeit in the first round, it is technically the 38th overall pick. And so that's what is set up on the mock simulator. And I was really curious to see what direction our listeners are going to go here, because they've got their defensive tackle, and now they got another weapon for Geno Smith in the receiving core. But there's certainly some areas of need in the trenches still. And our listeners decided to address that on the offensive side of the football. And O'Cyrus Torrence, the guard from Florida, doing this poll today, he was actually losing halfway through the 10-minute period. He was in second place, and then I was typing something up saying this could be a close race, and then I turned around, and he was up 15%. It just changed in a heartbeat. And then didn't let go of that separation, didn't let up, and Torrence wins fairly comfortably for this selection. Now, Rob, we've talked a lot about O'Cyrus Torrence throughout this pre-draft process because we know Gabe Jackson's gone. Phil Haynes has never been a full-time starter. He is on a one-year contract. If you have an opportunity to bring in a player like Torrence, who is a 340-plus pound road grader and also didn't give up any sacks in college at two different schools, when you have an opportunity to bring up a player like that to compete with Phil Haynes and likely be the favorite to win that job outright, it's a pick that makes sense. And at the same time, I only gave this pick a B-, in part because there were some really fun players at other positions that were still available. And also, I do wonder at this point, if this is the kind of guard the Seahawks are going to be trying to bring in now with Andy Dickerson as the line coach and running more zone concepts. I don't necessarily know if the scheme fit is going to be there anymore for this type of guard.
Yeah, I love that you mentioned that. That's one of the reasons why I gave him a B grade for this selection as well. Whether you want to call it the 37th or 38th overall pick, I mean, the point is the same. It's a pick that is 5 or 6 after the turnover between the first and second round. So, damn it, I think the Seahawks should be getting a player that we're seeing in all of these first round mock drafts that we fully expect to go in the top in the first round, and then possibly slide a little bit out. That's what we see happen all the time, is the teams in the top of the second round, they get a player fall into their lap that everybody thought was going to be a top 25 selection. So it would make sense for Seattle to be able to get that. And with O'Cyrus Torrence getting the hype, and having the success that he had previously at Louisiana, and then in that one season at Florida, going to the Senior Bowl, kind of easing some concerns about whether he was just kind of a function of Billy Napier's offense, because that was his head coach at Louisville. That was his head coach at Florida. I think that eased some concerns in that regard. I feel strongly that it eased some of the Seattle's concerns, just knowing that they were very much paying attention to what was going on at the line of scrimmage there at the Senior Bowl. But I love, again, that you mentioned the fact that O'Cyrus Torrence is the big, burly, kind of downhill run blocker that he is. Does he really fit in with what Seattle is looking to do? Is he really the best player available at number 37/number 38 overall? That's the questions I have. I gave him a B. I'd love to see Seattle continue to improve the interior of their offensive line. To me, the defensive interior, the offensive interior are the issues for this club. So I like the idea of this selection even more than I actually like the actual player. But either way, I still think that this is a move. If Seattle is addressing the interior of their offensive line on day 2, I think that this team is going to take a big step forward next season.
And I guess this is where you and I differ. And those that listen to our show regularly, you know that I'm a big O'Cyrus Torrence fan. Maybe I like to prospect more. I just question the fit. I really like the player, though. So the grade doesn't reflect the player as much as I'm not sure if this is the best landing spot for him. If this was 2 years ago and Mike Solari was a line coach, I'm giving this an A- because I think it would be a great fit. But this is a different type of offense, and it's a different coaching staff now. And so I do have some questions there. I don't have questions, though, about the second pick that our fans projected here in the second round. In fact, this was a player that finished second in the poll at pick 38, and he somehow was still on the board at pick 53. And that is Drew Sanders, the super athletic linebacker out of Arkansas. And this might be another one, Rob, where I'm a little higher on the player than what you are. I gave this one an A-, though, and interestingly, you gave it an A because there were still some other players on the board that I was intrigued by. But at the same time, this is a kid that could potentially be an edge rusher in the NFL at 6'5", 235, 240 range. I think he's got the frame. He's kind of a lean build. You could put an easy 10 to 15 pounds on him, and he had 9.5 sacks last year. This kid could actually be a very good edge rusher in the NFL. But he also had an interception and several pass breakups, and he's got the athleticism to play coverage. He had times he was out of place last year for Arkansas, but I think some of that because, quite frankly, he didn't play much his first 2 years in college at Alabama. He went to Arkansas to get that opportunity. A very good player that just got drowned on the depth chart on Alabama's NFL-studded defense. But this kid himself is a very good NFL prospect, and so I look at him as kind of that Swiss Army knife linebacker that teams are looking for, that maybe the Seahawks might even view him as an edge here. And some of our listeners even commented saying, I'm drafting him as an edge rusher, which adds a lot of intrigue. I like the positional flexibility. For me, this is an A-, maybe even an A, because I really like the prospect. And at 53, it's outstanding value.
Well, and that was a big part of it for me as well. I mean, if Seattle in this projection had selected him at 20 overall, then yes, I'd be more in that B range, because I do see, again, a little bit of bust factor with a player in Drew Sanders, who, as you mentioned, was asked to play a completely different situation at Arkansas as an off-ball linebacker after previously had been kind of playing that edge rusher role. But when he signed with Alabama, Corbin, he was the top-rated prospect out of the football-loving state of Texas. And he just had the unfortunate reality of trying to back up some guy named Willie Anderson Jr. And what are you going to do? You're just not going to get very many opportunities. So that's why he wound up transferring to Arkansas. And in his one season in Fayetteville was absolutely dominant. So you love the upside. And again, I love that our listeners, viewers, whatever you want to call them, thank you again. I love the versatility that he offers. You can be that inside linebacker. You can be that edge rusher. He gives you all kinds of really fun opportunities as a blitzer. This is a dynamic athlete. And I've talked about this before. I do not like this rookie linebacker class, and when it comes to off-ball linebacker guys. But Drew Sanders, to me, is the one guy who does have that, just screams that upside. And so I get it. If you want to draft early on this player, you just really believe that he is a guy that can kind of take you to the promised land. I think that this is a position that Seattle has, giving themselves a little bit of insurance by bringing Bobby Wagner back in, and of course, Devin Bush as well. But still, this is a position I think is a concern. And again, the versatility that he offers, the length, the speed that he offers, I think is pretty exciting as well. So again, at number 53 overall, thinking that he might be a candidate for either of Seattle's earlier two picks that we just talked about, I think that this was one I could fall in love with if this is the way that Seattle's draft actually went, addressing those other concerns a little bit earlier than having Drew Sanders just fall into your lap here at 53.
Let's get to our third round selection. Now, it's not going to be the one that the Seattle Seahawks are scheduled to pick, because unlike the last two times that I pitched some trade opportunities in our mock draft on Twitter today, our listeners got an offer from Jerry Jones to move down from 84 to 91 and add an extra fifth round pick. And they decided to take it. Over 65% of our listeners says, yes, let's do it. Let's get that extra fifth rounder in this deep draft. Moved back a few spots. And I personally was sitting there with a little bit of sweat beading from my forehead, because I'm thinking, we've got a couple centers on the board here that might be gone. Who are they going to end up picking? But our listeners came through on this one. It ended up being a very tight race, but we get our new center here in OLUWATIMI from Michigan, Senior Bowl representative, played really well in Mobile. Now, you and I have a little different viewpoints on this one. I do wonder about scheme with this player as well, coming from Michigan. At the same time, I guess I have less reservations, because the guy started at 3 different schools and played at a high level in Division I saw what he did in the Senior Bowl workouts, saw what he did in the college football playoff, and just the leadership that he brings. I think he's a guy that comes in right away and competes with Evan Brown for that starting job. And that's what Seattle needs to do. You need to bring in a rookie that at minimum is going to be able to give Evan Brown a battle for that starting job. And you're hoping maybe beats him out, so you have a affordable rookie under contract for the next 4 years at the pivot position. I really like the pick just because of the leadership, and he's a pretty darn good run blocker too. Has a little bit more flexibility in that regard with zone and gap schemes than I think some people realize. I don't see quite the square peg going into a round hole fit here as maybe I see with Torrence. So that's why I gave it a B+.
Yeah, and I do see some schematic complications, but like Osiris Torrence, I just think that Olu is a big, physical, strong guy that had dominant tape. I mean, this is the Remington Trophy Award winner, as the nation's best center. He was the finalist for that a year previous at Virginia. So this isn't just because Michigan is Michigan. This is a really good football player. And then you mentioned he was at 3 different programs. He went to Air Force originally. Air Force runs a lot of wide zone and option that you have to be able to block on the move. So this is a guy you kind of look back on what he's done over the course of his career, and he fits a lot of those things. What he is now, though, I think is at his best of just driving forward straight ahead. You mentioned previously about, some of the guys that might have been a better fit in previous systems that Seattle has employed. That's what I wonder if OLUWATIMI could be that. At a B-, though, that's the lowest grade I give any of these draft prospects. I think that this is an above average class that our viewers and listeners have, kind of argued here for the Seahawks. And if you're going to get a starting caliber center after trading down at this point in day 3, I love the selection as well. So again, there's other centers in this class I like better. I think are better, cleaner schematic fits. But still, I am absolutely loving the way that the listeners, created this draft for the Seahawks. And I think that John Schneider would be feeling pretty darn good if this is how his class wound up after days 1 and 2.
We've got 6 more selections we've got to go through on day 3. We're going to go rapid fire through those. Tons of great selections from our listeners. We'll get to those here in a moment on our Mock Draft Monday edition of Locked On Seahawks. This episode is brought your way by FanDuel. The NBA playoffs are finally here. Now is the perfect time to download FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook, because new customers get a no-sweat first bet up to $1,000. That's bonus bets back if your first bet doesn't win. Just download the FanDuel Sportsbook app. It's safe, secure, and super easy to use. Then you can bet on everything from the money line to points scored and three-pointers drained. I'm a huge fan of player prop parlays, and you can make bets during the playoffs, such as Stephen Curry going for 20-plus points as the Warriors get ready to battle the Sacramento Kings. Plus, FanDuel even lets you combine your bets for a chance at a bigger payout with a same-game parlay. So don't miss the chance to get your no-sweat first bet up to $1,000 in bonus bets when you go to FanDuel.com/lockedon. That's FanDuel.com/lockedon to learn more. Make every moment more with FanDuel, an official sports betting partner of the NBA. You're listening to Mock Draft Monday here on the Locked On Seahawks podcast. I'm your host, Corbin Smith. Glad as always to be joined by my co-host in crime, Rob Rang. And a special thanks to all the 12s out there, as always, for making Locked On Seahawks your first listen. We appreciate it. To check out for the Locked On NFL Scouting Podcast with the Draft Dudes. From free agency to the draft, salary cap management, and more, join NFL experts Kyle Krabs and Joe Marino as they take you through what it's like to build a successful NFL franchise every Monday through Friday. Find Locked On NFL Scouting with the Draft Dudes wherever you get your podcasts and on YouTube. All right, Rob, it's time for day 3. Rounds 4 through 7, we've got an extra pick thanks to that trade down in the 3rd round. So 6 selections left in our fan-driven mock draft. Some really fun ones for us to talk about. To speed the process up a little bit, this is day 3. Picks come in a lot faster. We're going to be doing a little bit of a snake thing here. Rob, we're going to start with you with Seattle's 4th round pick. And our listeners decided it was time to go into a deep running back class with a player that I know, at least in my case, is one of my favorite running backs in this deep class. And that is TYJAE Spears, the running back from Tulane.
Yeah, this is the first player that you and I both agreed and gave him an A grade. I think that TYJAE Spears has a real chance to being a top 100 selection. To get him at this point in the draft, I think would feel really, really good. And he's a bit of a slasher. He's a very different running back than what Seattle currently has, of course, with Ken Walker III as your primary option. DJ Dallas is a good football player as well, but TYJAE Spears offers a little bit more, big play ability. And that's one of the things that I like most about him. The Seahawks are going to know him very well. Pete Carroll had to have his heart broken when he watched the way that TYJAE Spears, as well as a couple other pretty darn good Tulane players, Dorian Williams, linebacker being one of them, the way that they were able to beat USC in the bowl game. That's where TYJAE Spears really caught the attention of a lot of people out there, but then followed that up by a very impressive performance during his workouts as well. He's not the elite receiver that I think that Seattle might be looking for at this point, but I think that he has potential in that regard. And considering the way that I've seen Ken Walker and Chris Carson, and as well as Rashad Penny, develop their hands, I do think that this is a really intriguing fit, especially for this late in the draft.
Yeah, I really like this value. And our listeners, there were a few running backs they looked at in earlier picks, and there were a couple close calls, but ultimately this ended up being the sweet spot to get that change of pace back to go with Ken Walker III. And this might be the last time we talk about running backs. It might not be. We'll see. Now, going to the 5th round at pick 153, this was my lowest grade in the draft. at a B-, and that is Terrell Smith coming in at 153, a new corner. Now, I will say this right now, Rob, you obviously viewed this pick much more highly than what I did. Maybe just boils down to evaluation of the prospect. But I looked at some of the other corners that were still on the board, Riley Moss from Iowa being one of them that I just personally think overall would be a better fit for the Seahawks. This kid has the size. We're talking another 6'2" corner that looks like a safety, but that's where my issue lies. I think he's a safety at the next level. I don't see a player when I watch Minnesota. There's a lot to like about him. He's physical. He comes up and he hits people, but I don't necessarily see somebody that's got the change of direction skills to be an outside cornerback in the NFL. And that's my assessment, just watching a lot of Minnesota and Big Ten football. I do see a guy, though, with his hitting ability that can come up and stick people. I have questions about the change of direction skills to be an outside corner, and also very limited ball production as well. And we know that that is a big part of Seattle's evaluation process with corners. And so while I like the prospect enough, if there weren't any other corners on the board that I thought still made sense, then maybe I would value this pick a little bit more. But I just personally think that it's a little bit of a reach with some of the players that were still there.
Oh, I agree with you. It's a little bit of a reach in terms of production. I just see a really explosive athlete, 6'2", 200-pounder running 4.4s. Those don't come on trees. And so that to me is one of the reasons why I'm kind of intrigued by his potential. You know, Corbin, I thought that it might have even been more appropriate if I kind of, just gushed a little bit about the upside I see with Terrell Smith, because I think that there's another player coming up that you might be excited about. So just really quickly, again, with Terrell Smith, I just see cornerback as being a position of concern for Seattle, just because they've got a lot of talent there. They also got a couple of guys like a Trey Brown, who I think personally should slide inside. I don't see a lot of size, length, production on the outside. I'd love to continue to fortify that with youth. And again, to me, I think that there's going to be some corners that have some really Seahawky traits that are going to fall into that 4th or 5th round. To me, that's the sweet spot for Seattle. Riley Moss, I think, is a good football player. I'm not trying to, disregard that possibility. But at the same time, I think if you want to look at the traits that we've talked about before, the height, the arm length, the straight line speed, the physicality, the multi-year starter, then Terrell Smith has a lot of those. But again, there's another defensive back out there in JL Skinner who's got a lot of those traits as well.
So this is the one that drew the ire of many of our listeners on Twitter. And quite frankly, it kind of drew my ire running the poll, because we've talked about JL Skinner a lot on this podcast, not just because of his comments comparing his game to Cam Chancellor, that being his icon. And you can see it in his game, the way that he plays. He's a 6'4" safety. I hadn't seen anybody in any of these mock draft simulators that had lower than a 3rd round grade for him until the Draft Network. And I read through the profile they had, and they made some valid arguments for why he was the 177th prospect on their list. I disagree with that, but he is coming off an injury, and there is some question marks in terms of scheme flexibility. I think it's going to have to be a certain type of defense where he is going to be able to fit in. That being said, I think the Seahawks fall in that line. We've seen what they've done with big-bodied safeties. You need an insurance policy. If the Seahawks can get him in the 5th round, we're talking a guy at 6'4", is a remarkable athlete, has really good ball skills. He comes up and thumps people. I don't give A-pluses in these very often, but if this kid somehow was there in the 5th round, I still have reservations that that's a reality, but that's the way these mock draft simulators work.
Sure.
If he somehow falls into that range, you just lost Ryan Neal. Right here's your replacement, a guy that's got more upside and is more athletic than what Ryan Neal is in JL Skinner. And so this would be the very rare instance where I would give an A+. Now, I know this next player on our list, ending our 5th round here, we talked some running backs last week, and I know this was a player that you've been very high on that didn't quite make on your top 10 list, but still would have some value. And when, as I said, TYJAE Spears might not be the only running back. Well, our fans made sure to get 2 to get some backups for Ken Walker III, and this one being Dwayne McBride from UAB.
Yeah, I mean, we talked before about with TYJAE Spears, how he's a little bit of a slasher. Dwayne McBride is the finisher. I mean, he is the guy that doesn't have a lot of make you miss. He's just got nastiness and physicality up front. If we were going to compare a running back in recent years that Seattle has had to Dwayne McBride, I think it's got to be Chris Carson. A little bit more of an angular build to him, but at the same time, will put you on your posterior if you happen to be between him and the red zone. Again, not much of a receiver out of the backfield, but if you're looking to complement the dynamic player that is Ken Walker and a guy who already has proven versatility in DJ Dallas, and who knows, again, if TYJAE Spears is the selection earlier, I still think that Dwayne McBride or another back late in day 3 would make some sense. There's a lot of Seahawks fans out there, Corbin, who would hate the idea of Seattle using one pick on a running back. I think that this is more likely that this could be 2 or even 3. Seattle did that a couple of years ago, 2016. They had 3 different running backs they selected. I think that this is the class that warrants it because the talent is that good. I think the Seattle depth chart is a little bit concerning at the running back position as well. I love the selection of McBride, at least, again, at this point in the draft, rather than as the day 2 pick that some have forecasted him as.
I had a lower grade on this one, and it had nothing to do with the player, and it had nothing really to do with the process of getting another running back. It's just there were some really good edge rushers that were on the board, and I guess I just kind of had I don't know what word I'm looking for here. It was a begrudgingly lower grade just because I thought, why aren't we drafting an edge rusher? But that's beside the point. I still love the player, though. I'm a big fan of McBride. Now, we've got 2 picks left. Let's get to the 6th round, pick number 200. I was wondering at this point, we've gotten Jalen Carter in the 1st round, but we don't have that nose tackle. And a lot of the big ones, the big name guys, they were gone much earlier in the draft. But our listeners astutely noticed that Broderick Martin was still on the board in the 6th round. And this is a guy that maybe isn't much of a name in terms of draft circles outside of your scouting circles, but this is a massive human being that also has underrated athleticism for the position. This is one of my few A's that I handed out just in terms of value, because I think Martin's a guy that could go earlier just because there's not a lot of these big guys in this draft class, and he's one that's got a lot of upside. Seattle, if they can get this kid at pick number 200 with Al Woods no longer being on the roster, Brian A being injured, potentially missing a big chunk, if not all of next season, this would be a home run with a guy that at his size, his ability to stuff the middle, as John Schneider pointed out in his radio show a few weeks ago, these kind of guys you can usually plug in and get them snaps early because of what you're asking them to do. And he already checks off the boxes. He's big, he's strong, he's physical, and he is very difficult to move.
And he's athletic, as you mentioned before. Mr. Former tight end. I mean, This is a guy who, again, is a pretty athletic guy. Had a really unusual career path. Wound up at Western Kentucky. That was the second college that he played at. Kind of jumped into football a little bit late in his relative athletic career after playing some other sports earlier. And I think that he has got the physical upside that will intrigue Seattle. I do think that they are likelier to go with a position or go with a player that is a little bit more pro ready, a player that's played at a little bit higher level of competition. But at this point in the draft, I think that it makes an awful lot of sense. And there's a lot of nose guards in this draft, some including a couple of guys that I've talked about, Mazi Smith, Keandre Coburn, who got, relatively shorter arms, 32, 33-inch arms in the case of Mazi Smith. With this young man, he's got 35-inch arms. And so the strength that he offers is very real, and the length that he offers. And so again, to me, at this point in the draft, it makes some sense. I don't view him as a likely starter in the next level. I think that he's more like a Brian Monet guy you can put in a couple of snaps. And so to me, I think that he's a nice complement to what our listeners had Seattle doing number 5 overall with Jalen Carter. And nose guard is a huge area of concern for this team. As I mentioned, Brian Monet, he's the only true nose guard that's on this roster right now. And obviously he is coming off of an injury. So I like the idea of doubling down at this position. I like the idea, if you're going to take Jalen Carter early, get somebody late to push the young man. That to me is one of the reasons why I'm higher on this draft pick, the idea of it, than I am the actual player. I think you might be able to get him in the 7th round.
Let's get to our last pick and the Mr. Relevant of the Seahawks, so to speak, from our listeners in this fan-driven mock draft. And Rob, I'm going to dish it over to you because, as you mentioned, this is not a very deep linebacker class, but there is a player that recently visited with the Seahawks, at least met with them, wasn't a top 30 visit, that comes from the University of Florida. It wasn't Anthony Richardson. It was a linebacker, and our listeners clearly were paying attention because I put his name on the poll, and he won by resounding fashion. Ventrell Miller from Florida.
Yeah, if you watch a little bit of YouTube video on Ventrell Miller, you're going to get excited about this because the guy's a thumper. And Seattle needs that. They need a guy who plays with a little bit of intensity. He's a little bit taller than that former TCU linebacker that I'm spacing on here for a moment that Seattle had in the interior at the inside linebacker position. But he plays that same type of mentality. This is a physical downhill kind of play. He's not going to be able to give you much in terms of third down as a pass rusher or as in coverage. But at the same time, he is physical. He's a team leader. He is a guy that, having watched as much Big Ten tape as you may have watched, Corbin, over the last several years, I promise you I've watched at least that much of SEC tape, and that's where Ventrell Miller really stands out. He plays the physicality that Seattle has required at the linebacker position in the past, and so that's why I think that this is a player that makes some sense. As you mentioned, he was recently invited to Seattle, and again, if you're going to go with the inside linebacker who has a little bit of question marks around, like a Drew Sanders earlier, then double down and get a player who's going to push him and play actually the role that Seattle is lacking at right now, and that's stuffing the run. Ventrell Miller can do that at this point in the draft. I think that he is absolutely a steal.
And I think it's a fitting potential replacement a year or two down the road for Nick Bellore on special teams. Yeah. This is a guy that has the mentality to be able to handle that and could maybe be your special teams captain down the road. He's that kind of a kid. I just don't know that he's got the upside to be a starter on an NFL defense. Those are the kind of guys, though, you take in the 7th round. We greatly appreciate all of our fans chiming in with this fan-driven mock draft. We had 3 different polls that had over 400 votes in this mock draft and several others that were just below that. So we had a lot of people that were involved, plenty of commentary as well as this draft was unfolding. So again, we greatly appreciate all the 12s for making Locked On Seahawks your first listen 5 days a week. As always, you can follow me on Twitter, Corbin Smith NFL. You can follow Rob at Rob Rang. Subscribe and follow Locked On Seahawks on YouTube and all major podcast platforms for free to ensure you don't miss an episode. Coming up, Rob, continuing to talk because draft's coming soon. We're going to look at what things might look like if the Seahawks picked all offensive players. It's going to be a lot of fun on our Tuesday show. Looking forward to it. Hope you'll be listening in. Enjoy the rest of your Monday. Go Hawks.